Everybody seems to know that all of these diseases, obesity, coronary heart disease, atherosclerosis, Alzheimer's, macular degeneration, diabetes, all these things are connected by mitochondrial dysfunction. Why are they connected by mitochondrial dysfunction? Primarily because we are poisoning our mitochondria with seed oils and this high omega-6 diet. When you consume a lot of omega-6 fat coming from these vegetable oils, as it accumulates in our body fat, it becomes pro-oxidative, pro-inflammatory, toxic through advanced lipid oxidation end products, and as I mentioned before, nutrient deficient, has no vitamins A, D, or K2. This is the perfect recipe to drive all metabolic disease and lots of physical degeneration. And I see people give up seed oils and have physique transformations and astonishing changes in laboratory studies, reversal of diabetes and metabolic syndrome. It's stunning what will happen in 6 months to a year.
Let's jump right in talking about how you got your start on this topic of seed oils. So, when did you first get turned on to their detrimental effects on our health?
Yeah, first, thanks for having me on, Jesse. It's an honor and pleasure to be on your show. So I really got into nutrition research. Re- Basically, was born out of my own suffering, um, and that was, in my case, that was arthritis, which started for me when I was 33 years old, so almost 30 years ago, and and it progressed pretty severely until I was 50 years old. But anyway, at that point, back in 2011, I tried kind of a partial paleo diet, and I had this enormous improvement in my arthritis in a matter of a week. And this was literally just life changing for me. And and after that, I read Lauren Cordain's book called The Paleo Answer, and this led me down the path. Then eventually, 2 years later, I came across the work of Weston A. Price, who connected processed foods to degenerative disease for the most part, and then I began to investigate the relationship between processed foods and age-related macular degeneration, AMD, the leading cause of irreversible vision loss and blindness in people over the age of 50 worldwide. And that eventually led me back to where, the fact that I kept seeing, Jesse, that it was the seed oils, the vegetable oils, that are the huge driver of overweight, obesity, and chronic disease like coronary heart disease, strokes, cancer, diabetes, on and on. And so that's where my life has taken me. My research has taken me, um, particularly over the past 5 to really maybe 8 years. A lot of that has been spent investigating vegetable oils and chronic disease.
Talk about that moment specifically, though, when you talked about processed foods and in the health and wellness space, there's a lot of talk about things like sugar, processed foods, different oils as well. But what was it for you about these seed oils that really grabbed your attention and started this digging that you've continued till this day, and this being the primary focus of your work?
Yeah, the well, first of all, in 2013, so a decade ago, after I read Weston A. Price's book, Nutrition and Physical Degeneration. He connected refined flours, refined sugars, canned goods, sweets, confectionery, he called it, and vegetable fats, he called them. Instead of vegetable oils, he called them vegetable fats. He connected those to dental decay and degenerative disease, like arthritis, cancers, birth defects, numerous diseases. So I was already convinced that vegetable oils were a problem, and then I began to investigate that in late 2013, and by early 2015, I was so convinced that I was at least on the right path in terms of processed foods being a major driver of age-related macular degeneration, which is something that ophthalmologists deal with all the time, that I decided to leave practice to pursue that. And so this is a huge turning point in my life to actually leave practice to pursue this. But with millions of people going blind from this disease, I just felt compelled to do it because it had never been, nobody had ever developed the hypothesis or raised the hypothesis that processed foods might be driving age-related macular degeneration. And so I partnered with a number of ophthalmologists in the South Pacific Islands because the macular degeneration was rare there, and I partnered with a nutrition researcher in Macedonia, and she and I collaborated for that next year and a half, particularly, and so she was collating the data on sugar and vegetable oils, which were processed food markers essentially, and correlating that data to macular degeneration prevalence. And we did that in 25 nations. And so I literally, kind of held my breath as she sent that data to me, like one country at a time, because it was a lot of work, it took us about 15 months of working on that pretty much full time. And so I kind of held my breath as that data came in. But I'm getting to your question, that the thing that sort of blew me away, Jesse, is that it was the vegetable oils that were the huge driver of macular degeneration, not sugar. And I was actually really kind of disappointed to see that because, for example, there was one country that kind of, because I felt sugar at that time, I felt sugar and vegetable oils should probably be equal in in causing chronic disease. And there was one country where we had really high sugar consumption, but almost no vegetable oil consumption and almost no macular degeneration. And that country was Kiribati, which is in the Central Pacific. It's something like maybe 1,200 miles or so south of Hawaii. And but anyway, I'm not dead sure that the data on the vegetable oils was entirely accurate, but nevertheless, I think their seed oil consumption was really low. And so I was troubled by this because, I thought, well, the sugar should be a causative factor, but it didn't seem to be, at least in that country. But anyway, so the next 3 years I spent, further investigating all of this connection between vegetable oils and the mechanisms and the data that connected or correlated vegetable oil consumption along with overweight, obesity, coronary heart disease, cancers, diabetes, and so on. And by 2018, I was just overwhelmed with so much data I'd been working on that was showing this strong connection between the vegetable oils and all this chronic disease. And almost nobody else was, really talking about it very much. So that's why I went public with that in 2019. And that's kind of where the science has led me.
If you're enjoying this episode, let me know by tapping like and subscribe below. Thank you so much, and now back to the chat. Let's go back. I think at this time would be really helpful to talk about the history of these oils. And we've been going back and forth and using different terms, vegetable oils and seed oils. The way I understand it, vegetable oils is a made-up term for the market to help market them as healthy. Is that correct?
I think so. The term vegetable oils came about somewhere in the early 20th century. If you had used the term vegetable oil in, let's say, in the 19th century at all, nobody would have known what you were talking about. Because really, there's no such thing as a vegetable oil. These oils don't come from vegetables; they come mostly from seeds and legumes or beans, and then the tropical oils. But we can get into categorization later. But the way that if we just take the United States as an example, we had zero vegetable oils up through 1865, with the exception of just trivial amounts of olive oil. So very, very few people in the United States would have had any access to olive oil, but that would have been virtually the only oil that was available up through 1865. And then manufacturers introduced cottonseed oil into the food supply. And it was a hard sell because people at that time, they knew cottonseed oil only as machine oil, lamp oil, and possibly as fertilizer. There was no other use for it. So that didn't really make sense to people to be eating something that they mostly considered to be lamp oil. But the manufacturers weren't really deterred for very long. What they did then was they began to mix cottonseed oil with butter to create margarine. And then they sold that under that term. Oleomargarine is what they called it. And then they began to adulterate olive oil with cottonseed oil. And that worked. They were able to sell that. Essentially, at least in the United States and in Europe for a while, until they were shut down when the French made complaint in 1880 that they knew that what was this so-called olive oil coming from the U.S. was not truly olive oil. And then eventually, the Procter and Gamble made Crisco, which is trans fats, and that was basically so margarine was like was the product to replace and supplant butter, and then Crisco, trans fats, which is partially hydrogenated cottonseed or vegetable oil, that was made specifically to try to supplant and replace lard, and it worked because they market it. And so what happened? So we got cottonseed oil in 1866, essentially entered the food supply. So right after the American Civil War, then soybean oil in 1909, and then all the others, just landslide, because it was so profitable. Because the products that were being made from, like cotton seeds, were waste products. In fact, most of these seeds are, right. And so, but they figured out a way that they could crush these seeds and then chemically alkalinize, bleach, and deodorize them, and they could get them into the food supply. They're basically tasteless, and they began to replace butter, lard, and beef tallow, the animal fats, with these. And so then we got after cottonseed and soybean oil, then we got corn, canola. I said cottonseed, rapeseed, grapeseed, sunflower, safflower, rice bran, sesame oils, peanut oils. All of those then entered the food supply in the U.S. And so here's this data. If we want to refer to this graph, you can see that on this graph back in 1865, this is when vegetable oils were absolutely zero in the food supply, unless you want to count this, uh, a very, very tiny portion of a gram of olive oil on average, But anyway, so then you can see that, but in 1909, there's this big jump. It went from about 1 gram a day in 1908 to 9 grams a day in 1909. And then you can see it climbs all the way to 80 grams per person per day by 2010. Well, 80 grams is 720 calories worth. That's 32% of U.S. caloric intake. And we can come back to this, but what you can see happening is that the vegetable oils are supplanting animal fat. So go back to 1900 there. You can see I put on the graph 99% of added fats from animal fat, lard, butter, and beef tallow. And by 2005, 86% of added fats came from vegetable oils. So in terms of the added fats to the diet, the vegetable oils almost completely supplanted and replaced the animal fats. Now, I'll just mention, I've got the U.S. dietary guidelines where we were told to go low fat on there. That came about in 1980. And in the past, there are a number of researchers who have tried to tie all of our health problems to this, to the fact that we were told to go low fat. And we dropped our fat consumption, but this wasn't the problem, because as you can see, the even though our fat consumption was going down, more of it is still coming from vegetable oils. It's going up and up and up. It was still on the rise in 2010. And I think it's pretty much leveled off since then. That data is not on here after 2010.
You've named a bunch of the different oils we're referring to here. How are they mostly getting in the diet? Is it processed foods? Are people typically cooking with these? Let's talk about entry points that people need to be aware of.
Yeah, that is the perfect question, Jesse, because almost nobody is pouring vegetable oils. I shouldn't say almost nobody, but I think the huge bulk of people are not pouring the vegetable oils into their food. They're getting it from processed foods, from restaurant foods, fast foods. So if you look at all of the processed foods, and you look through hundreds or thousands of labels, you'll see that you'll almost never find lard, butter, or beef tallow in any of these processed foods. You will always find vegetable oils. And in the United States, that's primarily soybean and canola oils. And that's the favorites of the restaurants. They're using almost exclusively soybean and canola oils in the United States. Um, and but you've got all the other oils being used as well. And almost all restaurants are cooking in some kind of vegetable oil. Again, mostly soybean and canola. The fast food restaurants are all cooking in vegetable oil. Every single major fast food restaurant they're all using vegetable oil. So anything that has an added fat to it, like French fries, for example, they're always cooked in vegetable oil.
You talked about the early history there, the fact that in the beginning, to turn people onto these, they would mix oil with butter. I think it was cottonseed oil and butter to make margarine. And then you talked about in the 80s, the food guidelines talking about low fat. I'm just curious, in your opinion, was it a combination of those two different arenas, like the marketing from these companies that were making them, plus the food guidelines that have brought us to where we are today?
Absolutely, it was all of that and more, and the fact that that Ansel Keys, researcher from the University of Minnesota, and the American Heart Association, who he was on the board with, uh, they began to recommend vegetable oils beginning around in the late 50s, and by 1961, I believe it was, the American Heart Association, with Ansel Keys on their board, recommended that we use vegetable oils in order to reduce our cholesterol. That was the goal. They said saturated fat's the problem, and we need to replace saturated fat with polyunsaturated fat, and that's what. So the vegetable oils are very rich in polyunsaturated fats, omega-6 and omega-3 fats, and so that combined with what was going on in the market and the fact that people are told that they're healthy by these organizations, and these organizations have only grown. Today, the Harvard School of Public Health, Tufts University Nutrition Department, Mayo Clinic's Nutrition Department, Cleveland Clinic, all of these organizations are recommending vegetable oils. And they're all recommending them for one reason, because they lower cholesterol. And when I'm presenting live, I sometimes say, this is true, they lower cholesterol, but so does arsenic. And it's not meant to just be a joke. It sounds like it, but they both have a lot of similarities, because the primary problem with vegetable oils is that they cause they're pro-oxidative in the body, and we can come back to mechanisms later.
Sure. So just to clarify then, I said the low fat movement, it's actually a movement from saturated fat to these vegetable oils. So it wasn't that we're eliminating fat, it's just changing from the animal fats to the plant fats.
Yeah, essentially. Well, we did go low fat. It worked. The In 1980, when the U.S. dietary guidelines came out, and we were all told to go low fat. I mean, I lived through that. I was 19 years old when that came out, and so I remember we followed this to the T. We all thought that as long as something didn't have fat in it, that you just eat all you want, right? And but what most of us didn't really realize is that they were taking the fat out, they were taking the animal fats out, and they were putting the vegetable oils in, and they were also putting in, at that time, more sugar and more carbs, of course. And so that's how the food manufacturers responded to the U.S. dietary guidelines to go low fat. So, but what's happened is that we've since vilified sugar, mostly properly so, and now the pendulum has swung because we really went low fat, and our fat consumption in the U.S. in 1980 dropped from around 41% over the next decade down to about 33%. So we really did do what we were told to do. We went lower fat, and then now the pendulum has kind of swung, and we're reducing our sugar and our carbohydrates. So that's, and I've got graphs on that if you want to take a look at that. But anyway, that's what's happened. We've now we're as a whole, we are dropping our sugar and our carbohydrate consumption a bit.
Got it. So it was low fat, but when you're gonna have fat, it's to go for the plant fats versus the animal. Got it.
That's what we've done because that's what we've been told to do by the major government and non-government, like university, the institutions that are held in such high esteem. That's what their advice has been. So that's where we've gone.
So coming back to this graph here, the introduction of these oils, how long does it take before we start to see health issues when these start to hit the market in a big way?
So this is coronary heart disease in the United States, and you can see that in the 19th century, so 1800 to 1900, there was only 8 papers that I'm aware of. I can only find 8 papers reporting on myocardial infarction, heart attack. Um, there's I can't even tell you how many papers there's relating to coronary heart disease in the last 50 years. But you can see it was an extraordinarily rare disorder. Physicians did not know of coronary heart disease in the 19th century. They just basically it was never seen. 1912, you can see James Herrick published the first known case of myocardial infarction, heart attack. This was documented with autopsy evidence. And then in the 1930s, coronary heart disease became the leading cause of death in the United States. It was completely unknown in 1910. Like almost no, even the physicians working in hospitals had never seen a heart attack. And it wasn't that they didn't know what a heart attack was. They did, but they never seen one. And anyway, so by 2010, we're at 32% of deaths, almost 1 in 3 due to coronary heart disease. So we'll look at here's cancer. And you can see this is the data from in 1811 comes from the town of Boston, Massachusetts. It was about 30,000 people at that time. And their bill of mortality showed that 1 in 188 people, is about 0.5%, died of cancer. And I've been researching this for quite a while now, and they were very well. Cancer was very well known. It's been known for 4,000 years, essentially. So wasn't that physicians again? They certainly knew about cancer. But anyway, 1900, the cancer death rate elevated to 1 in 17. And again, by 2010, it's almost 1 in 3. It's 31.1% of people are dying of cancer. So that's a 62-fold increase in cancer deaths in 200 years. And it's not because we're living longer. I could go through that data separately. This is type 2 diabetes. If you look on the graph there, in 1890, Sir William Osler published this data that diabetes affected 0.0028% of people in the US. That's 2.8 per 100,000. You can see it climbed a lot. In fact, it climbed 132-fold by 1935 to 0.37%. And if you think about it, that's the difference there is mostly the vegetable oils. And anyway, you can see it just climbs. We're all the way at 13% by 2016, which is a 4,643-fold increase in diabetes in 126 years. Now, I always remind my audience at this point that if diabetes had doubled, that would be statistically significant. So if it went from 0.0028% to 0.0056%, that would be statistically significant. It went up 4,643-fold, from 2.8 per 100,000 people to 13,000 per 100,000. Again, but in almost perfect parallel to the vegetable oils. This is age-related macular degeneration, the leading cause of irreversible vision loss and blindness in people over the age of 50 worldwide. There is less than 50 cases in all the world's literature in an 80-year period between 1851, when it was first discoverable, and 1930. And then by 2020, we're at 196 million cases, expected to be 288 million cases by 2040. So again, a massive increase. This here next, this is Alzheimer's and dementia. And now, physician Alois Alzheimer diagnosed and presented the first known case of Alzheimer's disease. It wasn't named that at the time, of course. It was that they named it that later. One of his colleagues gave it this name. But anyway, first known case, 1908. You can see in 1948, for example, there was 150 cases in all the world's literature that year. Where are we in 2023? 55 million cases, 10 million new cases of Alzheimer's and dementia per year in the world now, 10 million. That's one new case every 3 seconds. And then we'll just go to obesity. And you can see that this is Scott Allen Carson's work from the 19th century. Obesity was 1.2%. In men age 18 to 80. There was no data on women. And you can see that obesity had already elevated 11-fold by 1960 when we were at 13% obesity. So this is when we thought we were really lean and fit and all that, and we had no problems. Well, it's not true. This problem was already well on its way. Again, you can see, I'll just pick a couple of them. 1999, we're at 30.5%. By 2018, 42.5% obesity is what that was in 2018. And another 31.4%, I believe it is, overweight. So the total overweight and obese in the United States as of 2018, right around 74%. Right? So but just this data, just on obesity, that's a 35-fold increase in obesity in 118 years. Again, from 1900 to 2018.
Wow, looking at these graphs is just so powerful for a couple of reasons. One, I knew we were in a real health crisis, but seeing how severe it is by the graphs is just crazy. And then two, thinking of these diseases as being something that have been around for a long time, and then again putting years to when they really kicked off and started to become real issues, it's really eye-opening.
Yeah, I mean, I spent probably at least a year and a half of my life just researching what I presented here in 3 or 4 minutes, whatever that took. It's that really a lot of that took me years to eventually come across, get all that data, because this data is really hard to come by. You just have to sift through thousands of books and papers and all that. But anyway, yeah. So diseases like coronary heart disease, metabolic syndrome, diabetes, macular degeneration, Alzheimer's, all these diseases are unknown in the 19th century, unknown. Like almost no physician on the planet had ever witnessed any of these diseases. And again, cancer was pretty rare at one point. And I'm working on a paper for that. We're going to present this. It's never been presented, this data that we're going to present on looking at cancer prevalence through history. But again, I'm finding that in the United States and in Canada, back around 1800, only about 0.3 to 0.5% of the people in those countries were dying of cancer. Again, it's in the U.S. it's around 31% today.
And where things become a little bit gray, and I think it's important for your hypothesis to sift through this, is the fact that during this time frame, we've had a lot of different changes in the food supply. We've had, trans fats, processed foods, sugars being introduced on mass scale, and refined flours. So many different changes a- along with the seed oil piece. So, to prove our point of why seed oils is the actual culprit, or at least a big part of that, let's get into the nuance of how we can tease those apart.
Okay. So we'll go to this graph. This is first, you can see here that this is a graph on obesity versus vegetable oils. And you can see that when in 1900, I'll just have to throw out some numbers here, when obesity was 1.2%, vegetable oil consumption was 1 gram a day. If you jump over there to 1961, when obesity was 13.4%, vegetable oil consumption was 19 grams a day. It's almost 1-for-1, like a 1 gram increase, another percent increase, not quite, but you can see it's close. Increase in obesity. And then you can see that by 2018, on the far right of the graph, 42.5% obesity. What was vegetable oils? Well, the data ended in the best data ended in 2010 when vegetable oil consumption was 80 grams a day. So we went from 1 gram a day, essentially right around 1 gram a day in 1900 to 80 grams a day by 2010. And so you can see this striking correlation with vegetable oils. Okay, so here we'll throw sugars into the graph here. And you can see the sugars in the green, vegetable oils in the blue, and obesity in the red. Well, you can see that, I'll give you a couple of numbers here. By 1890, sugar consumption was 10.8% of calories. It's actually pretty high. It's higher than the World Health Organization recommendations today. But again, we had obesity was 1.2%, and we had no heart disease, very low cancer, almost no diabetes. You jump over here, this part of the graph in about 1935, which is right around here. I'm sorry, that's right around in there. Sugar consumption was 440 calories a day. It's around 22% of total calorie consumption, right? And yet obesity was about 3 or 4%. And so between 1935 and way over here in 2016, which is where the data ends, the sugar hardly changed. So it was around right over here. We're around 440 calories. Here is 526 calories. It went up 86 calories between these 2 points. All right. So, and as a percentage, and we'll see this later, it was around 22% of the diet sugar back here in the 1930s. Right over here in 2016, 24% of the diet. So the sugar barely changed, right? While the obesity went from around 3% over here, right in here, 3% up to 42.5%, right? So there's a striking correlation to the vegetable oil consumption, almost no correlation to sugar consumption, even negative as we move forward. So this is a different graph, and you can see.
I just wanted to clarify, as we're all hearing about sugar, are we talking about just added sugar? Because sugar is quite ambiguous. Are we talking about
yes.
certain carbohydrates like refined flours are pretty much like sugar in the body? How do we define that?
Yeah, so I'm glad you brought that up. And I've got a graph on that, or a slide on that, but I'll just tell you so this data comes from the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, the FAO. And, or most of the data, all the data from 1961 forward. And anyway, other government organizations prior to 1961. But sugar is added sugar to the diet, and it's all forms of sugar. So it's all table sugar, whatever you want to call it, white sugar, brown sugar, powdered sugar, all of those, all of the syrups. So that would be corn syrup, high fructose corn syrup, maple syrup, and honey, and like all forms of any kind of added sugar, that is in the food supply. So like all of the sugar sweetened beverages, all of those things are what's labeled here as sugar. Okay, so it's not sugars in fruit and vegetables, right? Those are not tracked. There's no way to really track those, as far as I know. But anyway, this is just added sugars to the
And then
diet.
things like breads and pastas, is that included in your data somehow?
If they have, well, no, not that wouldn't be, that data would come under like carbohydrates,
Right. That's what I'm
but
getting
it
at.
wouldn't. Oh yeah, so I have that data. I can show you that too. So that's on a separate slide, but this is just added sugars to the
Got it.
diet. Yeah, yeah. It wouldn't be flour. That would be totally
Got it.
separate. Yeah, yeah. So did I answer you
No, that's
completely,
perfect. Yeah,
Jesse?
let's continue
Yeah.
with
Okay.
the next graph.
Okay, so this is much more recent. You can see this is the data on obesity versus vegetable oil and sugar since 1961, and we're kind of zoomed in here, but you can see between 1961 and 2016, I think is where this data ends approximately, that the sugars is only up 14%, but the vegetable oil is up 230%, and the obesity is up 226%. So again, the sugar's barely changed here, right? And then if we look, while obesity goes through the roof, from 13% in 1961 to 42.5% in 2018. And now we'll jump even a little more recent. This is 1999 to 2018, where we can see obesity climbed from 30.5% to 42.5%, but the sugar is on the decline. Right. So after 2002, sugar is overall trend is downward, but the vegetable oil is high and still actually climbing a little bit. Right. And here's another graph on the same thing showing severe obesity. This is the BMI above 40, I believe it is. That you can see severe obesity was 4.7% in 1999, jumped to 9.2%, doubled by 2018. But again, while the sugars are on the decline. And so I think we've gone through, let's see. Yeah, we've done these. This is, okay, now here's carbohydrates. So this is kind of getting at your question. So here's the carbohydrates you can see in the United States on the decline after 1997. But the obesity, and I'll show you the numbers here on a different slide. So here's obesity in 1997 was about 29%. And by 2013, which is where carbohydrates stopped declining, the obesity climbed to 38%. So we have this, huge increase in obesity, but the carbohydrates have been declining since 1997. And I'll jump down to, and this is pretty interesting because for those who just want to vilify carbohydrates, for example, in total, you can see that carbohydrates were much higher way back in, as compared to most of the last century. In 1909, when we were lean, fit, healthy, almost obesity and diabetes and chronic disease free. And then the carbohydrates declined through the middle of the century. You can see here, and then started climbing again, around around 1980ish. This is when we went low fat, right? So the carbohydrates go back up until again 1997, and then they began to decline again. And then interestingly, this green line shows the total calories. Now the calories have been going up as the seed oils went up, right? And there's mechanisms behind that. But anyway, you can see the calories went up, but the calories stopped going up in 2002, and they've since been on the decline. So during our worst periods of increases in obesity and diabetes, we have sugar, carbohydrates, and calories all on the decline in the United States.
No, it's interesting.
Sugar declining after 2002, carbohydrates declining after 1997, calories declining after 2002.
The calorie piece is particularly interesting because we know that the vegetable oils are getting into the body, hence your theory here, but yet calories are dipping when we know fats are
Mm-hmm.
high in calories. So it's just interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. So we could we touch on diabetes here in the US?
Sure, just a quick question as you click over to that.
Yeah.
As we're talking about vegetable oils, we've talked about a whole bunch of different oils that fall under that category. Are there different ones that are better or worse than others?
Absolutely.
Because that's such a broad category of different oils. And here on the graphs, as we're looking, I'm seeing vegetable oils and the general trend going up. But how do we, and again, this is going to bring us into mechanism. I don't want to detour us too far, but how do we look at the spectrum of different oils in bad, worse, and then even worse?
Yes. So that's a great question. So um, we have I have some data that's just the dangerous oils, what I would call the really dangerous oils, for example, in the US. And then I have some data that's total vegetable oils. There's very little difference. And so I would say, the vegetable oils that are really dangerous are the seed oils. And again, that's soybean, corn, canola, cottonseed, rapeseed, grapeseed, sunflower, safflower, rice bran, peanut, and sesame oils. Why those? Because those are the high omega-6 oils. They range in omega-6 linoleic acid, which is the primary omega-6 fat in any fat. They range in omega-6 linoleic acid from about 20% up to 78%. And if you want to contrast that to animal fats, so animal fats, for when animals are properly raised on their ancestral diet, which means they're not fed corn and soy, for example, the animals have a omega-6 linoleic acid in their body fat of around 1.5 to about 3%, roughly, or even 1.5 to 2.5, maybe 3%. Right. So contrast that. That's what our omega-6 should be coming from, is those. So then you have, so that's all the seed oils. They're ranging from 20 to 78% omega-6 linoleic acid. Then you have what I like to classify them this way: the fruit oils, which is olive oil and avocado oil. Those are, olive oil is about 10% omega-6 linoleic acid, but ranges from 3% to about 23%, I believe it is, in omega-6 linoleic acid. Avocado oil is about 14% omega-6 linoleic acid. Okay. So that's why those are so much better, is primarily that. Then you have what I call tropical oils, and that would be um, um, coconut oil, palm oil, and palm kernel oil. So palm oil is about 10% omega-6 linoleic acid, or I'll call that LA, okay? 10% omega-6 LA. Then coconut oil and palm kernel oil are both about 2% omega-6 LA, which is why those, I would say, are by far the healthiest oils. That's what we should be using if you need to use an oil. But I would just recommend everybody use butter. Just cook everything in butter, because it's around roughly 2.5%, 3% omega-6 LA. And it has fat soluble vitamins. It's a perfectly nutritious food. We use butter for everything.
Okay.
But that's
That's
how
where I
I
was
kind
going
of
to go
break down
next.
that
You mentioned these in
classification.
between oils, and a lot of them are touted as actual health foods. Well, including the seed oils. We've been duped in that realm. But things like olive oil in the Mediterranean diet are touted as something you want to be, olive oil, put it on everything, a lot of people are saying, and it's got all these different health benefits. So you're saying, given the research you've done and what you know, just skip that, go right to butter.
I would. We could talk about olive oil for a long time, but in a nutshell, I'll just say this, Jesse. The number one problem with so-called olive oil in the United States is that 4/5 of it, 79%, is adulterated, or not of good quality, and that's been proven by research. Um, So so when people think they're buying olive oil, 4 out of 5 bottles are not either not true olive oil, or the quality is very poor, meaning they're not packaged properly, they're old, they're oxidized, all these kind of things. So you got a lot of problems there. Then you don't know the omega-6 LA content of olive oils. But if you could guarantee that you've got authentic, fresh, properly bottled and stored olive oil and used within 6 weeks, I would say go for it. I think you're absolutely, it's a good, healthy oil. And then coconut oil and palm kernel oil, they're even better in my view. None of these oils, though, have any vitamins A, D, or K2, which you will get all of those in butter, for example. And you'll get those in tallow, beef tallow, too. You won't get very much of those in pork lard, of those vitamins. It's pretty. It's not a very good source of those fat soluble vitamins. But this is a huge part of what's going on with all of our degenerative disease and inflammatory disease, is this lack of fat soluble vitamins as well.
All right, that's a great breakdown. Where my head goes is you're explaining that with the olive oil, and maybe we can get into the specifics of your diet later. But for people that are having salads, butter just wouldn't work so well making a salad dressing. So I guess we can get into it now. Are you somebody that has salads? And if you do, what oil do you put on those?
You know what? I use melted butter for salad oil.
I've never heard of anybody doing that.
I might be the only one. Like I said, I use butter for everything. I will not use, if I'm going to use any kind of other salad dressing, I would use vinaigrette. So that's going to be like balsamic vinaigrette. So you're not going to have any of the highly polyunsaturated oils in that typically. I mean, if you find, it shouldn't have any.
Okay.
But anyway, yeah, I use butter for my salad. That's Otherwise I don't use it, because good luck finding any. You won't find hardly any vegetable any salad dressing anywhere that's not made with vegetable oils.
How do you feel about butter versus purified butter or ghee?
Yeah, I think they're pretty much equivalent. I think the reason that people like the Indians of India, they historically used ghee, and the main reason, as I understand it, that they use ghee, which ghee is clarified butter, and that means it has it even has the casein, a little bit of casein protein, milk protein removed. So it's so that's called clarified butter. And for anybody who might have allergies to milk products, then ghee is a really good alternative to butter. But I think very, very few people probably have that reaction. But so ghee, because it doesn't have any protein in it, it's just the pure fat of milk, right? It has a pretty high smoke point, so you can heat it to a greater extent before it starts to burn, essentially, and otherwise it's equivalent to butter. So I personally like the taste of butter better than ghee. And ghee is expensive, so that's at least it's expensive here. So I think you could use either one is absolutely fine, whatever is your preference based on your own reasoning.
Okay. And before we jump back to the slides, I just want to clarify. I think it'd be really good at this point to talk about linoleic acid, polyunsaturated fats, have a 101 on how all that breaks down before we get back into vegetable oils and what they're doing and the damage they're causing to the body.
Okay.
So you have the polyunsaturated fats. I'll just get you started here. And then you have your omega 6s and omega 3s. I'll have you take the story and talk about linoleic acid, how that fits in and go from there.
Okay. Trying to I'm going to get to a slide here, and I'm going to go through some metabolic pathways. But first, I'll just say this before we even look at the slide, that all fat is made up of saturated, monounsaturated, and polyunsaturated fats. All right. So as I said, let's just talk about the polyunsaturated fats. Those are primarily omega-6 and omega-3 fats, and all fat has omega-6 and omega-3 fats. All natural fat. I don't care where it comes from. If it comes from an orange or rice or animal fat, they all have omega-6 linoleic acid, and they all have omega-3 alpha linolenic acid. I would call those LA and ALA for the abbreviation. So those two fats, LA and ALA, are essential fatty acids. We must have those in the diet. And people and so there has been in the past people that thought, well, because they're essential, more of them is probably better. That's been another argument. This is absolutely not true, and this gets back to the dose makes the poison, because everything has a proper dose. Everything, oxygen, water, every single vitamin, every single mineral, everything you can think of that we would consume. Everything has an appropriate dose, and those are really, really important. So the amount, if your diet is, let's just say, 100% white rice, that's all you get, and your diet is, or let's just say, or maybe sweet potatoes, for example, and then you end up with about, like, if we use the sweet potato example, because this is actually true in a real life population, the Papua New Guineans of Tucacenta, their diet was 94.6% carbohydrate, and it's because it's almost all sweet potatoes. Well, they're getting their diet was 3% fat. Well, of that 3% fat, 0.6% of it is omega-6 linoleic acid, and it's probably around 0.3% of it is omega-3 alpha linolenic acid. That's plenty. That you're getting all you need. In fact, the data shows that the hunter-gatherers would get as little as 0.35% of their diet as omega-6 LA. And they're fine, right? That's because their diet is the animals in the wild, the ungulates, in other words, the herbivores or the hoofed animals that are ruminants. They have extremely low body fat in the wild, right? Their body fat is like 2, 3, 4%. And so they have very little fat, and so their omega-6 and omega-3 are really, really low. Yet hunter-gatherers, eat those animals, and they're absolutely fine. So they're supplying enough of their essential fats, right? These two, the LA and the ALA, right? The problem is when you get too much, and the reason it's a problem is because the omega-6s and omega-3s, they actually accumulate in our body fat. And I've got a graph on that I could come back to, but then if we could look at this graph, when you consume a lot of omega-6 fat coming from these vegetable oils, you can see as it accumulates in our body fat, it becomes pro-oxidative, pro-inflammatory, toxic through advanced lipid oxidation end products, and as I mentioned before, nutrient deficient, has no vitamins A, D, or K2. This is the perfect setup for metabolic disease and physical degeneration. This is the perfect recipe to drive all metabolic disease and lots of physical degeneration, is this right here. And so now we could get into much more complicated pathways, but I just want to show one other this is just a graph showing how the omega-6 linoleic acid, as it is attacked by free radicals like hydroxyl radicals, it develops a lipid hydroperoxide, which is a very short-lived species that then breaks down into these what are called ALEs, advanced lipid oxidation end products, like 4-hydroxynonenal, malondialdehyde, 9 and 13-hode, acrolein, and carboxyethyl pyrrole. As you can see on this graph, these are collectively These molecules are collectively cytotoxic, genotoxic, mutagenic, carcinogenic, atherogenic, thrombogenic, diabetogenic, and obesogenic. This, you can see, just this part of the pathway alone is a major contributor to these chronic westernized diseases.
Just for clarification, as we're talking about omega 3s, omega 6s, are we using omega 6 and linoleic acid as synonyms? Because I know there's other omega 6 fats or fatty acids
Yes.
like arachidonic acid. How do all the different ones fit in?
Yes.
Or is it just more general for the way we're discussing?
Yeah. So the no matter what fat it is, no matter where it's coming from, omega-6 linoleic acid, which is the 18 carbon omega-6 fat, is responsible. It accounts for about 90% of the omega-6 fat. So the rest is arachidonic acid and some other long chain omega-6s. But those two, linoleic acid and arachidonic acid, are the primary ones. And but the omega-6, I'll show this another graph. The omega-6 PUFA is polyunsaturated fatty acids, linoleic acid. You can see in this pathway, if you can see it, it ultimately produces arachidonic acid, as you can see here. And arachidonic acid then gives rise to prostaglandins, eicosanoids, leukotrienes that are all pro-inflammatory and pro-thrombogenic. So these molecules that are coming from these prostaglandins, eicosanoids, thromboxanes, they all are driving inflammation, vasoconstriction, and clotting. Right. This is a major pathway, for example, to drive stroke and heart attack, is through this pathway. So this is the pro-inflammatory pathway, and as you can see, and we won't go through it, but the omega-3s, they oppose that mechanism. That's why they're anti-inflammatory, essentially.
Got it. And coming back to what you said before, every food we're going to eat, including things like rice, oranges, they're going to have these PUFAs in small amounts
Yes,
at least,
that's
which,
right.
according to your theory and the way you look at this, is going to be enough to cover our essential requirements.
Yes, if your diet is 100% sweet potatoes or 100% white potatoes or 100% white rice or 100% bananas, all these things that you think of, we don't really think about that those have hardly any fat, and they don't, and it's really small, but those will supply enough of this omega-6 and omega-3s to meet your essential fatty acid requirements.
All right, I want to come back to something you talked about quickly before, the fact that these are building up in our tissues. So it's not just the fact that you're having some French fries, fried in some seed oil and 2 days later you're free and clear. Let's get into the physiology of how those become incorporated in our cell membranes, our mitochondrial membranes, fat tissue, our cells in general, and they're sticking around for quite a long time.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. So this is on this graph where you can see this is our omega-6 LA consumption going clear back to 1865. So my group modeled the diet of Americans in 1865 when we had absolutely zero vegetable oils. We determined that about the approximate average consumption of omega-6 LA was about 2.2 to 2.6 grams, which is 1.1% of calories. So that's where we were in 1865. That's where we should be. Ancestral diets, no matter what they are, they're all under 2% omega-6 LA. So you can see that by 1909, the omega-6 LA in the diet had doubled to 2.23%. You can see by 1999, it's 7.21% or 18 grams. And by 2008, we're at 11.8% of the diet is omega-6 LA. And so here, this is a study, this graph came from a study published by Stephan Guyenet back, I think, in 2015 or so. He published this. And you can see this is the percent of LA in the adipose, which is the body fat. And it was 9.1% on average back in 1959. and 21.5% on average in 2008. So, where should we be? Um, that this is where we should be. There's this graph shows that this is an ancestral level of LA in the body fat, and I know this from 4 studies done by Ian Pryor and colleagues back in 1969 in New Zealand and in Puka Puka and Rarotonga islands in the South Pacific. They studied the body fat of 4 populations in that area, and they were all on ancestral diets. And this is what their omega-6 LA was in their body fat. It averaged 2.86%. Since 1990, the LA percentage in the body fat all around the world, I think there was 15 countries that we got data from, and those averaged 14.2% LA in the body fat. So this, as you can see from all this data from DNAs and from this right here, our data, you can see that we're accumulating omega-6 LA in our body fat. And then that also is reflected in what is in all of our cell membranes and in our inner mitochondrial membranes. And this is devastating because it sets up this, as I said, pro-oxidative environment. This is something I haven't talked about, but I'll just mention quickly that when you accumulate omega-6 LA in your cellular membranes, it sets off this peroxidation cascade because we're making gazillions of free radicals that attack these unsaturated fats. And the unsaturated fat then undergoes a peroxidative reaction, and it ultimately damages a molecule that's primarily in the mitochondria called cardiolipin. And that cardiolipin, when it's damaged in the inner mitochondrial membranes, it causes those membranes to become leaky. And those membranes must be able to hold a hydrogen proton gradient. That's what is driving our production of energy, is because we produce this hydrogen proton gradient, and those hydrogen protons move through our inner mitochondrial membrane, going through what's called ATP synthase, and drives the conversion of ADP to ATP. That's our cellular energy right there. And so when you lose that gradient, this is what causes loss of energy production. And the very next thing that happens is increased insulin resistance. The cell becomes insulin resistant. And so this is what everybody seems to know that all of these diseases, obesity, coronary heart disease, atherosclerosis, Alzheimer's, macular degeneration, diabetes, all these things are connected by mitochondrial dysfunction. Why are they connected by mitochondrial dysfunction? Primarily because we are poisoning our mitochondria with seed oils and this high omega-6 diet, which drives this damage to the inner mitochondrial membrane. And this paralyzes, this causes severe dysfunction in the electron transport chain, is what we're talking about here. And again, this is a loss of energy. So I think this is the major mechanism for weight gain. It's the major mechanism for congestive heart failure due to loss of energy in the heart. This is proven in animals. It's a major mechanism to drive cancers, because when you can't properly produce energy, the cellular housekeeping goes down the toilet, and now you can no longer properly make DNA, for example, and make RNA and all that. So this is a way that you're driving mutations in the DNA. When it comes to the neuro disorders like macular degeneration, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's disease, same kinds of mechanisms. We're driving, cell with the cytotoxicity that we're getting from the vegetable oils. We're driving degeneration of neurons. So again, all of these things are all connected to seed oils.
All right, to make sure I understand that part about the mitochondria, What I'm hearing you say is when we take in these vegetable oils, when we make mitochondria, they're going to get incorporated in the wall. They're going to be more susceptible to free radicals, get damaged, and that's going to affect our energy production, affecting all these chronic diseases.
That's exactly right.
Okay, let's talk about for somebody, we touched on this, but for somebody that's been eating these, incorporating them in their mitochondrial cell membranes in general, fat cells, how long are they in the body for? And is there any way we can quickly get them out?
Yeah, great question. So there's good news and bad news here. Um, Let me give you the bad news first. Is that that we the omegas the fatty acid profiles in our bodies are reflected exactly by what we've eaten over the last 3 years, essentially. So for omega 6 LA, the half life in our body fat is published in different studies about 600 to 680 days. So we should just round it off to about 2 years. It is the half life. Now, I used to think that it would take, in pharmacology, we know it takes 5 half-lives to get rid of a drug, essentially. And I used to think this is what it would be for omega 6 LA, 5 half-lives, but it's not. You can, one study at least, I only see this from one study, shows that you could turn over all of your fatty acids in your body in 3 years. That's pretty good news, if you ask me. So if you completely stop consuming high omega 6 diet, then in 3 years, you can be down to an ancestral level of omega 6 LA, just like these populations that Ian Pryor and colleagues studied back in 1969 in the South Pacific that were not consuming any vegetable oils whatsoever, 2.86% body LA in the body fat, right? So now, is there any other way to speed this up? The only way I know is then you're going to have to ultimately burn most of that omega 6 LA or maybe all of it in order to get rid of it. And you're going to have to use it as fuel sooner or later. And you'll do that if your omega 6 LA is low in your diet. But anything that helps you to lose weight, which might be, I would say, mostly just exercise, is going to help you get there. And I see people give up seed oils and have physique transformations in a matter of a few months that are astonishing sometimes, and astonishing changes in laboratory studies, reversal of diabetes and metabolic syndrome. It's stunning what will happen in 6 months to a year.
So, as we're talking about these different oils and realizing how impactful in a negative way they are on our health, it gets me thinking about consuming whole foods like soybeans, corn. Some of these oils are things that we wouldn't typically consume, grape seeds or rapeseed, things like that. But how do you feel about those in whole food form versus the concentrated oils?
Oh, they're fine in whole food form. You'll get trivial amounts of these oils in whole food form, and in the whole food form, they're not processed like they are when you make vegetable oils. So they wouldn't undergo heat, high heating. They wouldn't undergo chemical alkalinization, bleaching, and deodorization. So these oils are heated um, typically 4 or 5 times and up to temperatures above 500 degrees Fahrenheit, which would cause a lot of oxidation. So, um, it, so it, Kate Shanahan said quite a few years ago, I remember she said in a presentation that nature doesn't make bad fats, factories do. And that is a powerful statement to me, and I really like that. And Kate and I are good friends. Um, uh, so anyway, people should keep that in mind. That the fats from nature are generally pretty good, but I have to say, I would not, just since we're on the subject, I wouldn't recommend people consume there's two other things beside the vegetable oils that can get your omega-6 high. Is number one is animals that have been fed corn and soy, they will develop. No animals eat corn and soy in nature. That's not a traditional ancestral diet for any animal, is to live off of corn and soy. But the monogastric animals, which would be like chickens and pigs, they can develop very high levels of omega-6 LA in their body fat, just like we do, because we're monogastric. And so they will develop omega-6 LA that's like 20+% in their body fat, just like you saw that Americans are currently, right? Typically. Well, if you're consuming that, that's a very high level of omega-6. So you have to, so CAFO raised, that's concentrated animal feeding operations that feed animals corn and soy, and particularly GMO corn and soy. Those animals get high levels of LA in their body fat. We eat that contributes to the problem. Another source of high omega-6 is nuts and seeds. And so I don't think to my knowledge, there's not any populations that, for the most part, that have almost no populations that have consumed high amounts of any kinds of nuts and seeds. They just were not available to hunter gatherers or subsistence agriculturists. They didn't have a way to eat nuts and seeds or year round, or use them as staples. So nuts and seeds are high in omega-6. So I think we should get rid of those. So in other words, to get to a low omega-6 diet, you need to eliminate the highly polyunsaturated vegetable oils, the seed oils, eliminate the CAFO raised animals, and reduce your consumption of nuts and seeds.
All right. No, that's important. I want to get into those two other categories. And the one area you do address being a little bit different when it comes to animals. And again, we want to always advocate for getting the best quality protein you can. And obviously, there's the animal cruelty factor we want to consider too. But when it comes to beef, you have a cool chart in your book that shows the difference between LA of grass fed beef versus conventional. And that's one animal where it's not as greatly impacted.
Yeah. In fact, almost not at all. And I just didn't know if I should take the time to make that distinction when I, discussed that a moment ago. But cattle or ruminants that have multi-chamber stomachs, one of those chambers is what some have called a biohydrogenation chamber. So the cattle, they can take a high omega-6 diet like corn and soy, and in that fermentation chamber, they will hydrogenate the omega-6 into saturated and monounsaturated fats, and that's what they store in their body fat then. So no matter what the cattle eat, or any kind of ruminant, they're going to have low omega-6 in their body fat. So they're much, much safer to eat from this standpoint. So I'll give an example. So a typical grass-fed beef would be about 2% omega-6 LA, whereas the corn and soy fed beef is maybe 3.5% omega-6 LA. Right, very little difference. I think the main consideration then, in my view, that I still choose 100% grass-fed beef, and you have to be careful about this when you're shopping, because there's a lot of greenwashing. They'll say grass-fed. Well, almost all cattle are grass-fed initially, and then they go into a CAFO for their last 3 or 4 months of life, typically, where they're fattened up. And that's on GMO corn and soy in the United States primarily. And so then they will accumulate the glyphosate poison, which is in Roundup. So these GMO, soybean and corn crops they're sprayed with Roundup, and this is a herbicide. But the glyphosate poison in that accumulates in those plants, and the animals eat that, and it accumulates in their fat. And so when you're eating CAFO raised beef or any CAFO raised animal that's fed those, you will be getting glyphosate in your food, and that is a problem.
How do you navigate eating out when it comes to LA? Is there certain foods we want to be on the lookout for that typically will have it added on top at the end or used in the cooking? Obviously, frying foods is a big area we need to avoid. But how have you navigated that, or do you eat out at all?
Oh yeah, I do eat out. So I know that every time I'm eating out, I'm never going to have the quality of food that I have at home. Never. Um, or very, very rarely, I should say. So I primarily stick with, mostly steak and or sushi. And if you're a purist, you're going to make an argument that even the sushi is mostly not wild caught. It's hard to get all wild caught sushi, and so the fish, it's a similar scenario for them. They're fed soy uh, uh, in these um, in these fish farms, and so they develop higher omega 6 in their body fat as well, and they could also accumulate glyphosate poison. But anyway, I mostly try to stick with things where they can't be pouring. They're not going to be pouring vegetable oil into the food, if that
Right.
helps. So I try to stick with things that like steak, mashed potatoes, or a baked potato, or something like that. Broccoli, sushi. Things where they're not going to be using oil.
And then coming back to the beef example, we know that even if it is a CAFO fed animal, when you're eating out, it's going to be lower in LA.
Yes. Yes. If I would say, the healthiest thing that you can get at McDonald's is the burger patties on the hamburgers. That's the healthiest thing there.
Let's talk about what you eat at home. You threw me a curveball earlier when you talked about using butter as the fat on your salad. What does a typical day look like for you now that you're aware of all this?
Yeah, well, I'll just try to tell you primarily what the things that I eat. So um, I first of all, I get. I mean, meat is. I always still think of my meat as when I say meat, that's beef, chicken, pork, fish, all those, or bison. But I think of that as the the centerpiece of my meals, but either beef or eggs. But I don't make it the enormous part of my food. So my total meat consumption is currently maybe just 10 to 12 ounces a day, and I usually eat a couple of eggs a day. All of these are coming from farmers and ranchers that ancestrally raised their animals, right? And then I eat a lot of different fruits, and I eat um, a lot of sweet potatoes, some white potatoes, some white rice, and I eat a lot of plantains. Um, so so yeah, so I eat 3 meals a day, and sometimes a snack in there too. I don't worry about I don't worry about fasting or intermittent fasting or any of that. I just fast overnight basically, and I fuel myself to work out, and um, so I am not at all. I do not follow low carb. I support low carb people all the time, and I'm supportive of every choice: low carb, high carb, vegan, carnivore, whatever it is. What I understand and what I teach, Jesse, I think it's supportive of all of these choices. So no matter what, if you're vegan or carnivore, this omega 6 concept, it applies to you, right? And every diet in between. It applies to all of us.
In your book, you talk about omega 3 supplements. I'm curious, there's some controversy there. Is it something you ever take? And how do you feel about, because again, this is the other half of the PUFA, the omega 3s, whether it comes to supplementing or eating fish, how does that ratio and interaction of the omega 3s and omega 6 play out, given all we've talked about when it comes to LA? Like having more omega 3, is there any benefit in the LA realm, whether it be through food or supplementation?
Yeah, first of all, I don't supplement with anything other than mineral. I use a supplement. I guess I have to take that back. I use a trace mineral supplement for my water because my water is purified. So then I have to re mineralize the water. That's the only supplement I use. Um, I don't believe in supplementing vitamins or any fats, and particularly omega 3s. I think supplementing those is a bad idea. The reason being is that, for example, when you pull the omega 3 fats, the fish oil out of a fish, it begins to oxidize. And it will produce these advanced lipid oxidation end products, as we were talking about. And those are higher on a gram per gram basis in fish oil than they are in vegetable oils. So, do I believe in fish oil? You bet. How do you get it? In the fish, in the real fish, a fresh fish. And you don't pull it out of the fish and put it into a capsule or put it into a bottle or whatever and consume it later. You've got all kinds of problems doing that, in my view. The reason that supplementing omega 3s, it could be perceived as beneficial. I'm not sure that it really ever is, and there's some serious problems with it. But is because the elongation the elong elongation enzymes in the pathways from omega, where omega 6s and omega 3s are converted to their longer chain uh, cousins. Those are the same enzyme. Both omega 3s and omega 6s use the same elongase and desaturase enzymes, and so you can temporarily overload that pathway with a whole bunch of omega 3s, and then you're not producing as much omega 6 long chain, which would be like arachidonic acid. And you're kind of short circuiting that inflammatory pathway, but it's transient. And if you still got this huge load of omega 6 there in your diet and in your body fat, how you're trying to put out a forest fire with a squirt gun doing that. It doesn't work. And this is why, for example, I don't know if you've seen these studies that have shown fish oil supplements have been associated with inducing atrial fibrillation, for example. Why is that? Well, I think it's because of these mechanisms and the fact that you're getting these high advanced lipid oxidation end products out of these omega 3s that are in a capsule or in a bottle.
All right. So bottom line, get your omega 3s through fish. Wild fish, not the farm ones.
Yeah, or even just all of your natural foods. That's all you need. You get all the omega 3 you ever will need from grass-fed cattle, for example.
And coming back to what we said before, every food that you have is going to have a little bit in there.
Yes, every bit of it. Yeah.
All right, Chris, this was a far-reaching conversation. We covered a lot. Any loose ends you want to tie up or anything else you want to share before we part ways?
Yeah, I'd like to share our book, if I could. Here's a view of it. This is my latest book with my co-author, Suzanne Alexander, but this is called the Ancestral Diet Revolution. I'll say this is a shameless plug because we do not profit from this book. We work for two nonprofit organizations, Ancestral Health Foundation and Cure AMD Foundation, and the royalties from book sales, all of our book sales, go into these organizations, and from which this helps to fund our operations and our research. So anyway, this I'd love for your audience to consider this book. This will cover what we've talked about today and a whole lot more.
Yeah, it's a great read. We'll link it up in the show notes. We'll link up your website, social media. Any other loose ends on things that we were talking about you feel like we need to tie up before we part ways?
No, I think we covered it, Jesse. This is great. Thank you so much.
Now that you're done with Chris, you're going to want to stick around here and catch my chat with Gary. You don't want to miss this. I'll see you over there.
Once you understand where the non-science is coming from, where the propaganda is coming from, and it is industry, pharmaceutical, and religious ideology. Now I understand why I was conned in my medical